Okay, I'm just going to sort of review and to try to propound a kind of a general sort of survey that will start to perhaps create some kind of jargon or linguistic labeling of these things, which will, maybe the labels that I'm proposing are too far off from the actual current clinical sort of association that is attached to them. But hopefully, at least in my own consistent use of them, it will be a portal into a greater understanding and a more integrated system. So I'm going to focus on trying to explain some other features within cluster B, but I'm still going to primarily focus on borderline. And I'm going to relate things back to borderline. And like, for example, I might not have a very clear definition of what is currently thought of as the constellation of symptoms that is known as histrionic disorder. So I might be using that word very incorrectly, but at least in whatever I am describing, hopefully that will be a consistent feature that can be tracked and attached to something within current clinical knowledge or collected observation or something like that. Okay, let me just get right to it. So I'm going to neaten up some things that I said about borderline. I don't think this actually revises or negates anything that I said. This just will put a more... I'm going to explain in such a way that I think it'll become more clear. So when I talk about the unconscious side of the mind, I'm going to be referring to it in two ways. I'm also going to be calling it the inner child. The dominant figure, which I think plays a major role in all cluster B personalities, is the inner child, which is, let's say, the first or the dominant and stable manifestation of the seat of consciousness that resides within the unconscious side of the mind, which for many cluster B people, I'm going to say, is not really unconscious. That cluster B is very much in tune with their inner child. Even the borderline personality disorder, although all appearances to the contrary. So continuing with the description that essentially these are just much more sophisticated versions of narcissism. That narcissism is, let's say, the fortified inner child. And the false self of the narcissist is really a hypothetical entity. It's a continual game that is being played by the narcissist, who is quite in tune with their inner child, who is thinking from the perspective of the inner child. The false self is a social valence. It's not a it's a medium through which they manipulate and coerce or conduct anything through. Perhaps to the inner child, it's a necessary medium. Anyway, I'm not going to focus on narcissism too much. Borderline is quite different. Borderline, the false self, is a shell, and I'm going to semantically define that what makes a borderline as opposed to a histrionic is that the borderline creates a mirage of a false self, which is fundamentally there to facilitate coercion and control from the inner child. And the functioning, the proper functioning of the borderline shell personality is actually to be a conduit of chaos, to be a conduit of inconsistency, because it is through that inconsistency that they can essentially control the subtext. And via the subtext, they can essentially codependently inhabit somebody else's feeling body. They can attach to somebody else's feeling body, and then they can share that feeling body and get somebody else's ego to attend to that shared pool of feelings, which are essentially being transmitted via the subtext because the pretext is inconsistent. So essentially, their feeling body is like an atmospheric cloud of chaos, which ends up sort of enveloping the host, which then attends to that feeling cloud like a stream of conditions and fleeting thoughts and things like that. So the chaos in the mirage shell of the borderline is the conduit, it is both it is the ongoing process of codependency, essentially. Um, and the need to get somebody else to try to regulate their feelings or attend to the thing that are causing the feelings, which are the belief structures, which are the belief structures which appear to be. It's really Machiavellian, because this shell persona is channeling different bits of information that are part of a bundle, and just a resource of a pile of descriptive mass, and then they will pick out the bits of descriptive mass to relay so as to create a coercive, precarious scenario that will enforce a certain level of attending to the subtext. So they will kind of, it's almost like, it's like an artist or a painter that will just keep on sort of throwing different colors in, because they've got this end goal in mind, and they don't mind essentially mixing the colors on the parchment, on the canvas, so that they just keep on adding, and then they just add the next ingredient to create the right shade, towards their end goal. Now, histrionic disorder, and I might be off because I'm not looking at a list of symptoms and things like that. I believe that's what's happening in histrionic disorder is that the shell is persistent. So as I said, that the borderline is completely in control of the subtext, the pretext that the borderline is creating is completely erratic, is constantly erratic, but let's say the hidden pattern within the stochastic inconsistency is the inner child acting through that shell. The histrionic has actually determined that you can do more and suffer less and control just as much, perhaps, just by domination of the pretext. And so, and they can, because the borderline is fundamentally, the borderline will use consistency if it's easy for them to do so, but at the earliest possible sort of sign of resistance, they will take the least path of resistance, and they will forego consistency, and their shell ego will potentially implode, or potentially need to be, let's say, replaced. So it'll kind of hit the reset button. So just as much as they linguistically hit the reset button by using descriptive narration of reality, of their unilaterally interpreted reality, of their imposition of the unilateral context to everything. So essentially, they are completely irresponsible relative to the pretext. And so a histrionic personality is someone who essentially sees that, no, it's better to have some structures within the pretext. And essentially that structure doesn't amount to much structure. It just amounts to the persistence of the shell. So they still treat it as a shell. It still is like there to suffer to some degree, but the whole pattern is generally its pretext can be more consistent. And this makes essentially the shell, or the shell of the inner child in the histrionic case is forming an independent codependency with the inner child in terms of its Machiavellian machinations, whereas the borderline is completely sacrificing the shell constantly, which is why it is prone to be completely re-emergent, why it is prone to reinvent itself and to completely come up with a new identity and such like that. Because it's essentially the only thing that is consistent about it is its irresponsibility, so that it can continue to manhandle the subtext by hiding behind an erratic pretext, which it professes not being able to be capable of understanding or managing, or whatever. So it's like a social game of playing the idiot. That's what the borderline is doing. And this can get it into displaying a whole level of like seeming sophistication, but it's so brittle it just falls apart, because it can't manage itself. Histrionic personality disorder tries to sort of, I think, its shell has a bit of a backbone, and this means that it will have a more persistent pattern, or a less abstract pattern, because it's not just irresponsibility in terms of the pretext. It has certain pretextual structures and demands, which means that the shell will fundamentally be inhibited itself from crossing certain lines. So in some sense, the borderline is just creating rules for everyone else, which it will profess to be following, but it doesn't apply them in both directions. Whereas the histrionic personality disorder does follow some rules, and then they will impose those rules even more vigorously onto others. Okay, so what's the point? So, I mean, in some sense, the borderline can seem to exhibit some histrionic symptoms, depending on the run that their particular shell is undergoing. But the shell is always capable of being collapsed. It could be that essentially you start off as a borderline personality disorder, and then you find a particular valence, a particular shell ego, which the inner child grows enamored with, or finds it that it is stable enough. I do think that histrionic personality disorder, I was going to illustrate it like this. I think that a histrionic personality disorder does have some hard lines, and they will actually leave a situation. If they look like that they're not going to get their way, if they look like that they're not going to be able to coerce and enforce their expectation, if it looks like that they're not going to win, the histrionic personality disorder will actually, they might protest as they're doing it so that they can keep the act up, as it were. But so they might say loudly things, but they will also pack their bags simultaneously if they see that there is no hope of actually fulfilling their manipulative, sort of plot in the subtext. They can conduct themselves to that level of responsibility towards a kind of, their shell will have a certain fidelity to the inner child. Whereas a borderline will not move until they have a new host, essentially, lined up to migrate to. There was another point that I wanted to talk about in relation to this. Oh yeah, so when I say that a borderline will exhibit some histrionic things, essentially they're using the resources that happen to be accumulated to that shell, to that particular shell. And so the borderline can also charge up a certain kind of histrionic leeway and capacity, or so that there's perhaps, it's like a sub-routine within that bundle of data, of that bundle of collected descriptive mass, that will, let's say, maybe that they can try to develop an argument or a kind of a rationale that they have, that particular shell has particular access to a certain particular descriptive mass. Now this is quite I was going to make this point about self-delusions. Okay, anyway, let me just move on. So in as much as the borderline thinks that it can use, let's say, the heuristic of demanding that rules that have been established be respected on both sides, and that this particular shell does accord to certain rules, they have the right to enforce that rule on somebody else. It's sort of like, that's the degree to which the borderline exhibits a kind of histrionic tendency. Let me just think about the suffering. But I guess, the only difference between why did I want to bring up this other stuff? And the histrionic, I think, therefore, as well, can exhibit more independence when they're in the act of wanting to attach their codependency. They can seem almost identical to a borderline. And, they have that same thing where whatever they're saying might, like, yeah, I don't know if I'm adding any value discussing these sorts of things. Let me just think. I guess it's also true that a histrionic could always fall back onto just being borderline, although that might seem dangerous because the inner child might have already made some kind of fundamental belief about persistency being required in order to have any kind of hope of a stable success or something like that, or how it has defined success. There's going to be some kind of internal value that the inner child possesses that is going to predict or is going to structure, if this kind of pathology is going to manifest or move between things. I think borderlines can very often manifest as a kind of histrionic if they have enough social, if they have enough environmental buttressing, essentially, to frame their ego. And so they have enough variety of different people that are consistent on the level of being able to essentially, I'm imagining people that are in corporations. I mean, this would perhaps be very rare because this whole thing would be very precarious. But I'm talking about, for example, if someone is in quite a high-powered position and they have to deal with many, many different people, and they have, let's say, the social power and leeway that they're able to, essentially, they can take from many different people parts. They can, what's the word? They can inhabit or impose their tendency within many different people's subconscious minds. and the amalgamate of that and the social consistency of that means that effectively they kind of get away with it. Because there are enough people sort of helping them do it. They've got enough codependent threads with so many people that they can sort of keep a stable, woven sort of thing going. They've got enough lines of collateral support to taking energy from many people's subconscious minds. And you might even find that what they'll do is they'll even invent controversy or certain drama to metaphorically vent and to sort of metaphorically satiate some kind of subtextual inconsistency that they have. So they will sort of invent busy work for other people, and their ability to control that scenario and to manage it and to be and to feel like they can depend on having that measure of control and power will effectively assuage, let's say, most of the pathology, most of the socially external manifestations of the pathology. So essentially this is a kind of pathology which could perhaps be ameliorated with a certain level of social status, power, money, control. But it could just as easily, if they don't have, it's weird because it needs a certain combination of both control and to be controlled in some scenario. Because if they were the leader of a company themselves, if they were the CEO, that probably wouldn't work. They would have to have a family dynamic that somewhat imposed a role on them, because they would probably completely unravel if they weren't somewhere in the middle of a hierarchy. To limit the scope of their drama and such. Okay, this is just an illustration, I guess. So essentially, what a borderline is trying to do is they're trying to find the conditions, and they're trying to find a codependency in which someone feeds them a kind of histrionic valence, or where essentially they don't want to do the borderline is trying to have everything their way. They're trying to have their cake and eat it. Whereas a histrionic is actually, their inner child says, okay, I'm going to endure the work of persistency, of having some kind of regulation of the pretext for what I'm doing. I'm going to do the work of having a persistent ego. And essentially, they are much more open and honest and direct about their coerciveness, about their one-sided manipulation, as it were. They are much more, obviously in a social way, they will still dress it up, they will still disguise it. But the borderline is completely subversive on this line. They will pretend they are what they're not. They'll pretend to understand what they don't, or to not understand what they do. They will just take always the path of least resistance, just to continually make somebody else endure them, and hopefully attach to their feeling body, and to have their beliefs and their descriptive mass dealt with, because of their persistent irresponsibility of maintaining any kind of boundaries within a kind of social pretext, or the pretext within a conversation. They cannot be bound. They are the dictator through talking in the narrative tense of just relaying descriptive mass that then must be burdened by somebody else's feeling body, or that they want to see somebody else suffer through or connect with and process on their behalf or in their interest. By the way, I think the way to actually deal with this is you completely disconnect from it. You tell them right out, if you have the leeway to do so. If they're not your boss, you tell them. What would you tell them? because they will always describe a scenario which they are, let's say, the victim of, or that it's happening to them. They'll describe it as if they are a passive actor, and and essentially they want a kind of fatalistic assistance. They want sympathy. They're trying. It's just a vector of extracting sympathy and therefore attaching to somebody else's feeling body, and you just basically say you don't deserve sympathy. If you can't manage your affairs, you deserve to suffer through those affairs, and I don't deserve to have my energy diluted by attending to your affairs. And really sadly they kind of have to, I think that they have to go through a certain kind of visceral suffering of losing everything before they even have a hope of turning things around. They have to hit rock bottom, as it were, because essentially they can just continually pass the buck. They can continually just add to their woes and use that descriptive mass to leverage against the next white knight or something like that. And unless they get home the message that essentially, this is the consequence of you not self-regulating, of you not having a consistent thing. It's not enough that they recognize that they're not consistent. They have to actually do consistent things. They have to behave consistently. Okay, so now I'm talking about... okay, so is there really a reason that I should be talking about histrionic personality disorder? So why did I want to bring this up? Because when I was talking about that, essentially that there are two structures in the unconscious side of the mind, and the primary one is the when I was technically talking about this in other recordings, I was saying that essentially that there's a kind of, I technically sort of described it, how there's a bank of information to be used to create the chameleon mirage shell ego, and then there's the inner child, which essentially you never see, and that if it's succeeding, will never voice itself. It will never reveal itself. But it's like a demon playing chess. It's not interested in talking with anyone, because that would make it vulnerable to being told, like, you need to change. It doesn't even want to make itself available to being spoken to directly. So if it can get away with it, it will always just manifest a shell ego, and then the more that it can get other people to invest into that shell ego and feel sorry for the shell ego, then essentially it has no motivation to essentially create an ego, or let's say a vector of communication, or a style or a culture of communication that has any consistency, or actually attends to the pretext that it is creating. It's much easier just to play stupid and to jettison its own pretext and to be as inconsistent and incoherent as it wants, as it takes the path of least resistance. So, I mean, the biggest thing is if you ever want to actually help a borderline personality disorder case, you have to stop dignifying the shell ego. You have to talk to the Machiavellian sort of central processing unit, the inner child, which it won't want to do, because if it admits openly that effectively it's all just a power game, it's all just a power grab, then the next step is there's nothing you can really do. They have to decide to value something different. Are they going to value reciprocity? Are they going to value, because essentially they're completely selfish and greedy in terms of power and control. And they don't want to give up any security of that power and control. That they are only self-interested. They are not capable of caring about anything else. And they have to change their value system. And, that's completely up to them. It's no one else can make that decision for them. And then so essentially they try to dress up that fundamental crux. They try to create a pretense that, it's a condition that's happening to them. They are passive, and then they just, describe themselves as not owning themselves. So, they're fundamentally opposed to this concept of self-ownership and self-regulation. It would be very easy for them to just recode their memories and to say, okay, the reason why these bad things happened is because it started with me, because I don't organize my life and think about things and manage my affairs in a behavior that is consistent with the idea of self-ownership and self-regulation. So they don't say this bad thing happened because I don't do the work. They don't say that. They create some story, they create a narrative, and then they always offer fake apologies. Linguistically, it's very manipulative because they will mimic the bare minimum of whatever is required. They will always perform according to some deterministic, coercive lever that they might be able to obtain. And essentially they will just describe something so as to say that they understand it, I guess, and then they will label that as an apology, and they will use the word apology afterwards or before it or something like that. But it's not an apology because it's not in the present tense. They're not talking about themselves now. They're talking about a description of themselves, an identity that they have functionally jettisoned. It's just more of the same ongoing procession of unilaterally narrating reality. So they will only admit to anything or acknowledge anything if it is essentially useful to what their immediate goal and power grab is. So this is the thing, is that they won't bear consequences. They will only bear consequences. They will seemingly bear consequences as a means to an end. But essentially the consequences that they bear will be the consequences of the chessboard that they're trying to tactically win through. And they're not willing to do the work of creating an alternative framework because they don't value an alternative framework, because they value their control. So I mean, they're a kind of solipsist. They're a kind of, it's a kind of reality autism. An autism on the level of that they are the authoritarian, perhaps of the moral authoritarian. Their ethic is based solely in their inner child, and the inner child is not willing to allow for any kind of so the inner child is completely closed off. Although it actually communicates, you can understand exactly what it's saying through the subtext. Which, I mean, this doesn't require, you don't need a high IQ to realize what's going on. People, when they deal with borderline personality disordered people, very clearly know what they are saying and what they mean through the subtext. So they will add the pretty window dressing, but the subtext speaks clearly, and they will, start to develop to hear the subtext, and it's very obvious the kind of thing that they are, So it's interesting because you get this juxtaposition, this hugely ironic, sort of thing where they create this erratic shell which says all the nice things and that promises to be pliable, but that is just a way to essentially get other people to host their feeling bodies and make it accessible to the control of the subtext of their inner child. What's the other thing? I mean, and this can also happen in other scenarios as well. I think political ideology to a large extent can be an extension. Any field, any specialized field. Sam Vaknin has often spoken about the kind of, there are levels of this playing itself out, let's say. I personally believe that unless a particular culture or a particular part of a culture, a particular subculture or a particular field or a particular institution, if it doesn't have someone monitoring, if it has been taken over by this stuff and that isn't actively able to resist this stuff, the legal establishment, I think, is the biggest example of this. The South African legal system used to be, for example, very, very reasonable on this. Its structure, its institutional structure, it's probably, I mean, we're in the in the moment, we're being taken over by fascistic legal positivism, and you can see, just the betrayal of the institutional structures or whatever. But anyway, like, it's obviously, it's the most important thing to have judges and to have legal people and institutions which are capable of rooting out this kind of subversiveness, let's just say. And in general, legal professions, depending how Napoleonic they are, depending on how much they are function from general principles and how much they function from plenary fiat, there can be inbuilt systems of resilience against this kind of pollution. Anyway, that's to a large extent a tangent, but I guess, in politics, I mean, the Nazis famously, I think that's a huge identity politics in general, has a lot of this stuff in it. The social justice movement. Anyway, I've got lots of recordings talking about how that's exactly the same as fascist philosophy. But and it does work different as an ideology in the full manifestation of the Führer principle. It's weird because, in some sense, it's trying to create a safe history in the way that I've termed it. It's trying to create a safe histrionic independence for all the underlings within the ideological canopy, within the ideological umbrella. And so, like, the actual leadership, the political leadership, the Führer principle is essentially there to kind of father the conditions of having a stable histrionic sort of identity that the political body is able to regulate and maintain and preserve the conditions that structure it. And then you get this top-down concentration of power, legal positivistic, sort of hidden hand, regulation of culture, where the main function of politics, in fact, is to freeze culture into a stable psychological medium for this thing to, so I mean, it is perhaps slightly more complicated when you have a Führer. And so you have, all these kind of intelligentsia sort of people, who are the armchair proto-Führers and the sort of, it is like a psychological takeover of a society, and it is a kind of like a virulent, sort of contagion. And it does precipitate its own acceleration culturally, because the more you empower these sorts of people to have institutional powers and you give them institutional codes of conduct and rules which promote the wrong people, essentially, and then these people can orchestrate their disgusting moral code and take out their and vent the pressure according to the rules of the general. Okay, anyway, this is too vague. Let me just move on. I mean, in some sense, this is the idealized consequence of what would be going on inside a borderline personality's ideal world. This is like how society would be orchestrated in the mind of a borderline. I mean, they don't have. I mean, the inner child might have such visions, but I mean, essentially, it's not. That's what they're aiming towards. I should probably talk about the histrionic more. Hmm. So the histrionic has some level of internal pathos, which is kind of the glue between the internal codependency between the persistent shell and the inner child. And perhaps there's even functionally, I'm creating two separate bodies there, but it's much more of a stable amalgamate than in the borderline two-tier thing where you have the shell which is capable of falling on its own sword for the interest of the inner child, whereas the histrionic has pretends this outwardly to have this self deception about not having a separate inner child, but the inner child is fundamentally integrated. So it is possible to talk to the inner child of the borderline as well. It's probably easier to talk about it with a histrionic person, although the histrionic person is using the pretext, the persistent false self, whatever you want to call it. They will lean on it heavily to gain the powers that consistency of that pretense offers them. And it can also be very intelligent, so it's almost like kind of a hybrid narcissist, um, that is very unconscious focused in that its inner child never gave up the reins. So essentially, the histrionic is almost a case in which they even developed a half-formed uh, emotional body. They developed a half-formed feeling body, but it needs a component to live with it, to somewhat suffer with it. Um, I was trying to think of the word. There is a word that means, like, I don't know, like sort of my association is like in the Spartan military, how they suffer together. I don't know what's that called, compatriotism or something like that. Um, that the whole histrionic sense is that they are trying to find a compatriot, um, which is its own perhaps form of intimacy or whatever that their inner child is capable of manifesting, and it's capable, which is an emotional kind of self responsibility, although it's still, I think, fundamentally toxic, and unsustainable, because essentially they are still needing somebody else to provide the ego energy. So effectively, they will invariably find someone perhaps to be codependent with them, or I mean, usually I think they can't sustain relationships very well. But especially with the kind of people that they'd have to find someone who was unconscious of their inner child so that they could kind of supplant with their inner child. But the problem is essentially, I mean, I guess actually histrionics could actually regulate a stable relationship if their inner child was capable of, you see, this is the problem, is that because they hold all the cards in terms of determining if something is equal or not, that will be the nexus of their relationships breaking over. Is essentially that they will broker deals constantly about what's fair, and if what they do is not considered fair by the other party, they will have no way to fix that. They can pretend to work around it, but they won't be able to apologize, or they will never be able to be wrong on that level, and so they will essentially be the kind of the dominant party in the relationship, and so they need to find someone who's completely compliant, um, and if they and the more sophisticated dealings that they do, essentially the more that they'll be able to maintain some kind of semblance of trust, that they are brokering things in a fair way, and that it isn't a one-sided relationship essentially. And I think histrionic personality disorders are also likely to essentially become control freaks and drunk on the power. um, and to take too much, and because of their inability to effectively issue a valid apology, um, because what does the apology even mean? In some sense, the histrionics are much more capable of emotional. I can't think of the right word, but the emotional facade that they create is a masterpiece of con artistry. It's amazing the emotional things that they can do. I mean, you can get them to cry and to beg and to demand, and 3 seconds later you can get them to speak in a robot voice and be completely cold and logical and hard, and essentially it's just a mechanism of conveying their design. It's just a conduit, essentially. They are effectively a because their half formed feeling body is there at the entire behest. The reason why their feeling body is half formed is because they don't have their own ego. They only have let's say, the feeling body that manifests as a direct translation of the state of the inner child with this other pansy shell, um, and the shell is just there to give them the ability to project that facade, um, in order to what's the word, um, lubricate their coercive dealings and whatever. And they would probably also maybe even correctly describe it as, sort of rounding the edges, softening the sharpness, sort of not being as brash and blunt, to soften the impact and to create some facility of social nicety or something like that. And then they're looking for a compatriotism, that is sympathetic to them, and in a way that they can repay that sympathy in a way that they can, sadly, because they are dealing fundamentally in a level of sympathy, they won't be able to sustain it. Well, it's very unlikely that they would ever be able to sustain it, because they will have to pay for that sympathy, and they will never want to pay too much, and they'll never get it right. In my opinion, I don't think it's really capable. I mean, there are some things that are spoken about in Scientology which are very pertinent to all of this, that have to do with energy, and flows, and all of this is all of these states of the inner child, because the inner child doesn't create the kind of meta regulation that only the ego can provide, because they all don't develop an ego. I mean, in some sense, you can still sort of, you might be able to even track some kind of ego that they implicitly would have if they ever developed it, because it would. Anyway, I'm not going to get into general personality style stuff, but just to say something like, they have an implicit imprint of what their ego would be if it was developed, and that will be essentially what they are needing to supplement as some kind of sympathy from some other thing, that will essentially have to know how to simulate that ego for them, essentially, and feed it to them with whatever machinery that person ends up having. And then there's obviously, so another person has to end up creating a kind of, anyway, let me not go down that avenue. What was I talking about? Energy. So, there are lots of different, because I mean, So the inner child is dealing with certain fundamental laws about energy. And when I say energy, I mean like energy in the level of the mind, which means that essentially mental objects that, let's say, according to how your mind is framing those objects, have a latent propensity that is exterior or external or objective. It just has a property that means something in a non-prescribed way, that it is that that thing belongs. Uh, um, uh, that thing has something in its belonging that is significant. It has some significance. So energy means very much like significance on the level of a potential consequence. So it has a significance that is that has the capability of rendering a consequence. That's what I mean by energy. So which is very connected to the actual definition of the word karma, which literally just means consequence. So karmic energy, a mental object that has a karmic imprint, or in terms of how it is constructed in the mind. So when you have energy in the mind, now all energy in the mind is created from that mind, and it can be uncreated. But essentially, if your inner child values energy, or it values protection from energy, or it sees energy as dangerous, and if you are invested into energy, then it is dangerous. If you need energy, if you believe that you need energy, energy is dangerous, because as soon as you deal in energy, it's likely to fuck you up. It's likely to do what you don't want it to do. As soon as you start contending with it and wrestling with it in your mind, it goes the opposite direction half the time. And, the more it does one thing, the more it has the possibility of swinging the other way, of the pendulum swinging the other way. The more you depend on something, the more it's likely to give you a bad hangover or something like that. So it's like, because of all the different dynamics in which consequences run through. Because there's an inexhaustible array of let's say, of potential drama and narratives, because at some point you have to frame it. At some point you have to take stock of it, which is fundamentally what the ego actually does. Now, essentially, these people, they want to get something from energy, so they know that the ego, I'm saying this in an overview sort of way, because they're not saying this to themselves directly, but they, let's say, instinctually know that they don't want to have any kind of meta cognition about energy, because if they do, the game is up. The ego already is essentially the obsolescence of energy to some degree. So these people would rather have, let's say, their implicit ego function being fulfilled by something else, by some other person, or by. It's interesting, because I think in a certain scenario you could have many people, none of them have functional egos, within my definition of ego, and essentially the drama itself will create, let's say, an emergent ego, but it's obviously, no one is necessarily thinking through that perspective, but it will sort of like, that perspective gets created automatically. Some people actually do it themselves cognitively, so they don't actually have to do things to get the mental consequence of it. They could just emulate it completely internally, or something like that. Anyway, so what these people have done is essentially, because energy has this negative and positive, they want to have something, or they want to not risk anything, or something like that in terms of energy, they end up creating a secondary mechanism to handle it, so that if anything happens to that secondary holder, it doesn't hurt the inner child. And that messenger, or that courier, is fundamentally always, let's say, sacrificed in the process to some degree or another. Whereas The histrionic sees the necessity to have a persistent career, and the borderline just keeps on making new ones, and essentially it makes them out of the parts of the old ones, and it just keeps on piecing them together, new ones. And it's just sending them out to go and collect energy, and to go and, you know, collect the kind of energy that only the emotional energy and the feeling energy present in other people's feeling bodies will, you know. So it's actively in the process of, you know, so it's this kind of, it's this great scheme, something like that. Okay, anyway. Narcissists, I think, pure narcissists are slightly purer than this kind of thing. They're almost not even interested in energy itself. I don't think they're not even interested. I mean, if they are going to have an energy signature about themselves, they want it to be like a good one or something like that. But I think in some sense they want to be apart from energy, and they just want to know that they still have a persistent existence, and so they just want to see what kind of impression that they can make within the surrounding energy around them, which they don't see themselves as included in. They see themselves as above it. So essentially they try to conquer energy without going through it. They try to conquer energy by staying outside of it. But then they end up needing to know that they did the right thing, so they have to kind of, they want to bend the energy around them. They want to create a disturbance in the energy around them. They want, when I say bent, I meant that, like, in the way that you can sort of, you know, they have got sort of a picture. When you have a picture and then you distort it by, like, sort of creating a black dot, and then you kind of create a ripple around the black dot, that actually there's nothing lost in the picture, it's just distorted it. So it's included like a black dot that gets to move around within the picture, and then the surroundings move out of its way. That's how I kind of picture the narcissist's interaction with energy, is that it wants to be able to move it out of its way so that it can sort of prove its own mastery over it, or something like that. And then in the same way that you could imagine that black dot moving around and creating that distortion around it, that, I mean, I would have to probably refine that analogy to some degree, but it would be something like the idea that it creates almost like a, don't think of it as a black dot, think of it as a white dot, and it wants the energy around it to sort of like see that white dot as being, let's say, like the pinnacle of whatever surrounds it, that it's sort of that it's like got a magnifying glass over that white dot, and so like it wants other energy to peer into it and to sort of see it as a kind of, as like a supreme energy particle, which the inner child of the narcissist is trying to exhibit the yeah. So I mean, I think on some level you could say that the narcissist's inner child has reified, it has objectified itself in terms of the energy narrative as being a supreme energy particle or something like that. But it is still got an energy representation, but it's like the summation of all possible energy condensed into a white dot that then can sort of pervade through it, but it doesn't pervade it evenly. It pervades it at a particular point. And so it's not real pervading, it's not real mastery over energy, but it's like it's an energy definition of having a mastery over energy. And it is kind of relegating the self into an energy particle. I think something like that is the narcissistic conception of self, uh, within my, if you just give me my analogy to some degree. And that is how it is shielding itself from the trauma of what it had experienced as a child or something like that. And essentially that is how it is able to kind of conceive itself as something like a god, in order to again shield itself and make itself invulnerable to the energy from the outside energy. So it is still able to relate to outside energy, but it relates to it sort of postulating itself to be a pure energy particle, a pure supreme energy particle. But the problem is that because it is a particle and it doesn't pervade all of energy, it doesn't actually know how to relate to it evenly, or it doesn't have a it hasn't developed any actual mechanism of engagement. But it does need to see itself, the reflection of itself, impressed in the energy surrounding it. So it is constantly trying to sort of obtusely garner attention to validate that self-image. I think that's a good analogy. Anyway, let's see if I can think of another analogy for like the borderline and the histrionic. You see, the borderline and the histrionic, again, that they don't have that white particle. It's not as abstract as that. It's much more delineated as a particular pretext or pretense of a shell. So they have invested into a particular form of garb, of clothing, of armor. The borderline is constantly redressing itself into a new identity, and it's like a disguise artist. So the borderline is like a disguise artist, is an inner child that just works out that there's nothing stopping them from just always being able to put on a different disguise, and that way essentially energy can't ever find its address and actually make it bear any consequence. And then it can, everything that it gets, it's like completely free and clear. Obviously there's a lot of suffering in that sort of process, which again it uses as the elements of its further disguising. And the histrionic has a particular disguise. The histrionic has a particular vessel that it is trying to win with. So in some sense, the borderline that has essentially is playing a game of chess, and it doesn't matter if the pawns die, because it can always just create new pawns, and it can, when someone isn't looking, it can put them in different places, and then it says, no, I'm playing the same game as you are. It always professes to be playing the same game, but it's constantly cheating even its own professed, sort of game to some degree. The histrionic is actually playing with a chessboard, and it is playing with some rules. But every now and again, it will try to I guess the actual thing about what the histrionic does is it actually enforces it. It has the same rules, but it enforces them inconsistently. That's the problem with the histrionic to some degree, and it will never abide by the rules unless the other person catches them out, essentially. And if the other person catches them out too much, then they will actually have the good sense of wanting to play with someone who doesn't catch them out. They will have some kind of internal regulatory rationale, like in that wise. Okay, anyway, I'm just going to stop talking now. I think I've covered everything that I've thought about. I have the time, so I'm going to complete and round off some issues that I kind of left that I want to give further attention to. So let me just refine something. When I am speaking about like the borderlines chess game, and talk, I was doing this to sort of contrast it against the histrionic and perhaps even and the particle of the narcissist. I mean, there's a level at which analogies fail, but I'm just going to try to clean this up a bit. So the histrionic is playing the chess game with some fidelity as to the pieces. They are just not playing it with perfect, let's say, good faith fidelity to the rules. And so in some sense, they even have like an outline of an ego which they are extracting coercively from the compatriotism which they are essentially demanding of people that they interact with to some degree. And that level of compatriotism is generally quite demeaning, because essentially the thing that they are trying to extract from somebody else's ego is very particularized. It's very specific to a particular context. And so it seems very one-sided. It seems very, it's very abrasive in a very particular way. The borderline is also abrasive, but it's on a subtextual level that's much more discreet. Although after enough of exposure, you start to see the patterns, because the chessboard is a similar chessboard, but it's hidden in a convoluted mess. Because essentially they are capable of throwing new pieces into it in an inconsistent way. So it seems like it's a different game, but they profess that, no, it's the same game, or they profess an apology that, oh no, they are trying to reset the game, they are trying to restart it. So they're always trying to restart it, but it's worse than that, because they try to still use the winnings that they got in the other iteration. So they try to sort of jettison the trades that they made, but keep the winnings from those trades, And they do lots of mechanics, like, for example, forking in chess is a good analogy for what a borderline will do. They will contend two different controversies in two different spheres, and then they will try to convolute them and conflate them together and talk about each controversy to the other set of characters, and they will try to get those sets of characters, one of them in either side, to somewhat take responsibility and resolve the compounded confusion. So they'll do lots of mechanics like this, which is a kind of like a mastery of a Machiavellian sort of surveying and pervading of the subtext. That essentially, because they are just kind of throwing descriptive mass here, there, and everywhere until it sticks to someone. So they're just constantly with this unilateral talking at people until something works. And until they find the right button to push, until they use the right sort of particular subtextual chaos, until they, because, you can often see that there's quite a lot of, what's the word? I don't know what it's called. It's a form of persuasion where people, I think it's called like subconscious persuasion, where people sort of say things out of turn, but it's a weird thing to say, but it has a kind of a connotative correlation and significance, which then ends up sort of trying to create, in a very soft kind of subtle way, it ends up creating impressions and connotations and sort of covert contracts in some sense. So there's a whole level of subterfuge, but essentially what a borderline personality is trying to do is they're trying to use chaos as a medium. They inject so much chaos into the pretext that they can essentially just atmospherically engulf their host to have to deal with their fleeting thoughts and dysregulated things, and have them regulate it or suffer through it or react to it in such a way that it garners some kind of reflexive capacity, a vicarious reflexive functioning. Sorry, there's another point that I want to add in this topic, in this area, is that the borderline, essentially what the borderline is actually trying to do, which is very hard to do. Well, I mean, it's not that it's hard to do. It's just that, like, it's not socially sustainable. It's always going to fall flat on its face. It's always going to run out. That essentially what the borderline is trying to do is it's trying to make other people responsible for maintaining a histrionic context and conserving and preserving and, in fact, giving the histrionic context to the borderline. The borderline is like a lazy histrionic. They just want to derange someone and wear them down with attrition to the extent to which that they will essentially create some kind of stable bartering or bribery or some kind of stable quid pro quo that functions on a histrionic level, but they're not even happy to play by those histrionic rules. So they want somebody else to, like, mop up after them and to try to give them a set of rules and beg them to play with those rules constantly while they continually derange and disorientate whoever is trying to impose those rules against them, and they want to be more special than the rules. So they almost want somebody else to try to convince them of being a stable histrionic. That's like their ideal circumstance. That's their perpetual codependency. That's their ideal codependent sort of relationship. Which is fundamentally, no one is going to tolerate that. No one is going to put themselves through that and endure it. But they want someone to suffer through that, because then it shows it amplifies the aggrandizement of the inner child. To see somebody else who would go through that endless sort of, senseless self-abnegation, so it's almost like a revenge against the environment for not protecting the borderline. The borderline essentially is trying to mimic the trauma that they endured. They're trying to find a stable way. Essentially, they try to perfect what they were hurt by. They are trying to essentially create a stable vector of whatever it is that they thought that they experienced. So it's sort of like they went with the energy that essentially upset them. They were like, I'm going to do one up. I'm going to do one better than yours. I'm going to do the same thing as you back at everything. And I'm going to hold everything accountable and responsible, and I have no responsibility. So now, how this ties together with, for example, the narcissist and things like that, and I understand I went into this analogy of the particle of energy and things like that, the narcissist. Now, what that should be thought of in the way that all these things are similar is that these are all games that the inner child is playing. These are all different games that the inner child is playing. So in the case of the borderline, the inner child is playing the game, I'm going to do one better. The narcissist is like, I'm going to transcend this as a particle of supreme energy. So I'm perfected energy itself. So it sort of is trying to sort of in a more pristine contemplative. Yeah. So now let me just say, all of these games are potentially games of no return. So these are kinds of games that people are playing in their own psychology, the games that their inner child has been locked into. And as much as that they value these games and they don't want to play a different game, that's the end of the story. You can't. These games have the capacity of being games of no return. Now, I should just also say the reason why energy has the kind of features that it does is because games themselves have a fundamental substrate which can be mapped, which I have essentially mapped, which is why I'm able to actually have a coherent model of personality style. And I've got this very elaborate thing which I'm not going into here, but so what's my point? I just wanted to say that
this more has to do with like the components of the different sides of the mind, like what emotional vectors that they're actually expressing and manifesting. And because emotion is very connected with that concept of energy, essentially, but how that's like an interlocking chain. I'm just trying to think how to in a cursory way just sort of touch this issue, because I just wanted to basically say that I mean, on the level that I've been talking about, it is not really important to go into these sorts of details, but I just wanted to say that essentially that this is a game that potentially is a game of no return. And all games themselves can be plotted against a kind of a meta model of games, which is also a meta model of energy, essentially. And that is how you can get a snapshot of someone's energy signature, as it were, in terms of their investment into energy. Okay, so I mean, yeah, I'm just talking about some general frameworks that allow me to sort of see what's going on and be able to plot certain things and monitor them. And so, generally there's this trauma that happens on the level of the true self, and then that becomes the superego, which manifests an inner child, effectively, which for most people becomes the unconscious side of the mind after the subconscious and the ego develop. But some people don't have a very developed ego. And they have a half-developed subconscious, and the inner child is still pretty much in the driving seat. And so they've got these. It's weird because essentially they are like half a person, and they need other people around them in some kind of constellation in order to do the implicit roles and functions that the other sides of the mind would otherwise do. They still need, because the false ego complex is balanced within itself, and it will always need to try to find or broker some kind of internal, because it has so much internal pressure, that essentially it does call to itself to actualize, it does call to itself to sort of refine or and essentially what these people have done is they have found a game to play within the ordinary, natural, general tendency of this. I mean, to some degree, you can just say it's a degree of sophistication that the so-called ordinary false ego complex is more well developed, is more mature, is more elaborate, something like that. Elaborated and self-contained, therefore, as well. It's able to be an adult, more so. Well, perhaps I shouldn't make qualifications like that. Those are like social normative measures, which are hard to sort of calibrate psychologically, but what should I say? Yeah, I guess I just wanted to, I don't know why, I just wanted to bring up the idea that essentially the game that is being played pertains to very particular content that will pertain on a particular level or dimension in, let's say, a model of meta games, of how games interrelate or whatever, which is like a very abstract metaphysical model. It's almost like a conceptual model. I'm ending up sort of just trying to explain some kind of rudimentary sort of theory about how actually where cognitive functions actually come from, and models of cognitive functions. That's sort of what I'm talking about, and how. But yeah, this particular game that has the capacity of being a game that doesn't end. That's, I guess, it's not such a useful analogy because now I'm sort of mixing it up with my other jargon of game. But so the ordinary emotional circuitry that would exist within a personality style is stunted and contorted to some degree by this other game that's being played, which you can call it the histrionic game or the borderline game or the narcissistic game. But there is going to be, let's say, a fixed, this is so, these are just like truisms. Obviously, the combination of these styles of things, it just essentially means that the one can almost be analogized to a game that deals with almost like, almost pure philosophical matters and issues. Well, not purely philosophical, but when I say philosophical, I mean like, that relates to those weird kind of philosophical topics that border the ground between psychology and philosophy, like solipsism, questions of solipsism and things like that. And the question of other minds, as it were. And perhaps issues like agnosticism and atheism. And I mean agnosticism and atheism on the level of other minds. Sorry, I guess I'm using those words as an analogy. So there's like an internal mechanism that's being orchestrated using a kind of, okay, well, let me be a theocrat and then pretend to be and have an outer shell that I use to filter my actions and behavior with my outside environment. I'm going to pretend to be an agnostic. That's kind of like what a borderline is doing, is that they are secretly a theocrat, and they are, and they themselves are the God that they believe in the theocracy thereof, but they pretend to be this kind of perpetual agnostic, and essentially the reason why that they can sort of play that game is because, let's say, metaphysically, they've just committed to a kind of nihilistic skepticism, which allows them to enact this. They might as well do it. They can seemingly get away with it. Who should stop them? Why should they stop? That's why it's a game that doesn't potentially ever have to end, because that's just what they value. That's just what they hold to be a value. That's what they have axiomatically decided on. This kind of very prime issue, the kind of the psychological basis is very close to what has been described, I think, very well by Vasti Ruot in her paper on nihilism. I think that's a very good model of how the inner child approaches or can develop in its full capacity, in its full potential capacity, to have a proper ego, that it actually handles and deals with skepticism. It overcomes skepticism not by negating it, but by fully addressing everything and accounting for everything that skepticism, or rather not skepticism, but absurdism. It doesn't, it's not in denial about absurdism. It is responsible because absurdism is the initial point that you can choose what you do. You can choose what you value. You can choose your own values. You can choose your own axioms. And because it takes that task seriously, it invents its own idea of integrity and responsibility. Anyway, this is somewhat of a tangent, but
Oh, I should have also added sort of an elaboration to the political stuff. So, I mean, what I said in the last recording about that a borderline wants the person who is hosting their fleeting thoughts to impose on them a or extend to them a stable histrionic sort of quid pro quo, which then they also, which essentially then they can also resist and flout to maximize their control and, sort of the lateral power of their ability to sort of impose contrivances and things like that, and sort of maximize that kind of that descriptive authoritarianism, essentially in their style of communication, which I mean is slightly concealed by social conventions, but it's very clearly in the subtext of that communication, in the tone, in the syntax, in the grammar of the syntax itself. Always talking about conditions in the past tense. So even the present tense is described as a past participle. They are narrating reality. That description of borderline, of essentially somebody else has to configure a quid pro quo and then try to motivate them to play that game, that histrionic game. So they want somebody, they even want to, so they want somebody else to suffer in order to, or burden the responsibility in their management and their administration, and so essentially they're almost like a perpetual petulant child, where they want to be adopted by somebody else who's continually attempting to impose on them a histrionic quid pro quo, and recalibrating that quid pro quo with revisions and updates according to the temperamental subtextual disposition, which is continually being inconsistently expressed. So that line is always just overridden by whatever the latest story is, the latest narrative, whatever the borderline happens to be professing through the shell. So the shell is there essentially to contradict itself, and even to absorb damage, to use that as leverage, to extract the sympathy in order to stabilize that codependent thing where they get everything, where they get their accountability and responsibility adopted by somebody else's feeling body that has to regulate them and try to bribe them. So essentially it's interesting because before they've actually got a stable attachment, they will actually reverse that role, where they will do it first. That's the deal that they will seem to be offering to other people. They will pander to them and be pliable to them, and they will actually profess a certain level of consistency in their pliability. But as soon as somebody else actually takes them up on that, as soon as someone enjoys that aspect that they offer, then they very quickly want the role to be reversed. They want it from their side. And it's much worse from their side because when they're, after the thing is established, because as I say, like, they will be petulant about the histrionic, so they will extract a histrionic bargain that the other person is essentially, it's their job to devise and offer. So essentially what the borderline is actually trying to do is they're trying to engineer subtextually the conditions so that somebody else will proposition them with, so that they can effectively avoid the histrionic, the problem, the exhaustion that histrionics will often, I think, complain of, if I'm describing it correctly. They don't want to have to endure the arduous work of having to maintain a persistent consistency in the pretext or the premise of what they're doing. They would rather have somebody else constantly trying to sort of mend and fluidly fill in the gaps of their barrage and torrent of substituted reality, of whatever the latest version of the new substitution is. So they're just completely revising it unilaterally. Sorry, there's one more dynamic that I should describe in here. So something about imposing. So they will also do other things very strategically. For instance, they will try to engineer that very particular form of codependency, and so they will actively act to disorientate and derange the other person's ability to contact reality. They will try to create the other person's sense of reality in a very they will make it prone to being merged with their feeling body. So they can be very particular about a certain kind of insidious subterfuge and subversion. I mean, it's basically a gradient scale of subversion. That's what they are always introducing their host to. So once they've got a host chasing after them, there's lots of wonderful examples of this in the Kay and Peele show. So called K. The Kay and Peele show. They had a skit with this woman and this guy, and he is always chasing the woman, and she's always running away from him, and she's always getting him into fights and things like that. That's a very good example of this. There's also another illustration that I wanted to talk about right at the start of this, about social expectations and conventions and social norms and ideologies and politics and institutional power like law. If you watch Star Trek The Next Generation Season 4, there's an episode in Season 4, quite near the end, I think it's episode 21, called Drumhead Justice. And there's a woman in Drumhead Justice who is the daughter of a distinguished judge, and she's quite elderly herself, and she is an admiral. And that's a very good example of a borderline concealing her pathology in the clothing of the convenient surrounding morality, as it were. Yeah, I just wanted to point that out. And I mean, the whole point of that episode as well is to say that, it's directly from Picard's mouth. He says at the end of the episode, "We will always have people like this in our ranks. There will always be a tendency to corrupt institutions. If we're not vigilant, it takes over the society. It infects the whole society." That is one of the major themes of that episode. It's really worth taking a look at. It's a very good example of how this temperament and this tendency can infect an entire population or an institution or a culture. Where the borderline is trying to stabilize themselves by getting the institution or the culture at large, or the power structures at large, to pander to them and to deliver to them a histrionic role that contains their... perhaps that woman is sort of comorbidly histrionic and you can see some of almost the borderline substrate poke through when her institutional power is not concealing her internal mechanics that well. But anyway, is there anything else I should say? I like that word that I used, compatriotism is the best way to understand what the histrionic is trying to do with their consistent persona. They're trying to extract compatriotism, whereas the borderline is trying to extract a kind of sympathy where the other person is responsible for having to engineer some kind of compatriotism which they can't even which the borderline is fundamentally antithetically sort of dispositionally allergic to any kind of consistency, because that will erode the power of being able to just unilaterally revise reality and speak for reality and dictate. And so they will constantly trouse the pretext of things. They will trouse their own pretexts that they have created. They will trouse their own expectations that they have generated. They have no consistent thread of self-ownership and responsibility. So, like fundamentally all their promises, or, it has no integrity. Just as well as they never actually profess any real acknowledgement and admission of fault. When you have to very carefully listen to what they say when they apologize. They don't use the present tense in terms of how it relates to their responsibility. They say, I did this. They describe what they did or something like that. And then they add the label apology to it. They don't, it's like they're describing history, and they're doing that as a kind of, as a token. I guess, essentially they will never burden any consequence. They will say these things so as to mimic something in a social way to avoid any negative consequence. They will only ever admit they will only ever voluntarily admit to anything if it actually enables them to orchestrate some kind of further power grab or something like that. So everything is just a furthering of their subtextual, you can only call it, Machiavellian domination and valuation of their own self-interest. There's no room for anything else. And the more that they try to extend, through the chameleon valence, through the mirages, and create perhaps even more sophisticated mirages that will essentially just be the same kind of thing, where they will, it's interesting how in 15 minutes time you're talking to a different identity has re-emerged with a new tact, with a new line to take. And it's just a new gambit, essentially. It's just an array of possible gambits where they have all these cards that they can potentially play, and they will even play them amongst each other, as if to subtextually demand, well, you have to accept one of these game pieces as you have to deal with me through one of these faces, through one of these game pieces, because they're not willing to expose any consistency. They're not willing to conform to any consistency, essentially because they don't want they don't want to give up the absolute power, essentially, that they have engineered within the game that they are playing, and they're not willing to make that game vulnerable or susceptible or do the work of constructing something else, which is their decision, essentially. it's funny because they'll even recognize that they're doing this, and then they'll say, "Why should I do something different? Tell me why I should do something different." You have to give them a descriptive motivation. It's like you have to self-interest them into not being self-interested. It's a paradox. It's not going to happen. That's the only reason why they do anything, is this unilateral concentration of power anyway. It's a committed solipsism. Um, the histrionic is weird because they're kind of agnostic to some degree. They've got one foot in either camp. Although I think the histrionic might just be a more, as I said, like they created a shell and then they decided essentially that they're willing to put up with the burden of consistency to some degree, of having a persistent identity. And I mean that's also, so I mean there might be somewhat of a spectrum somewhere in here. I'm not going to get into the details too much. Was there any other example that came to my head that was novel and interesting to bring up? So it's interesting, like when a borderline says that they want to change, essentially they're just saying that they want to be more successful at what they want their tactics to have a higher success rate. That's essentially all they're saying. They're complaining that they're not winning at the game, or at least the shell isn't winning. The chameleon mirage shell of the token identity that they are manifesting as a medium to dictate their narrative to someone who's willing to absorb that narrative subtextually, or to be spoken at like that. It's interesting because that subtext is quite a broad fabric, and it takes elements indiscriminately from different fields. So the chess playing demon underneath, the inner child underneath, knows a lot about a lot. They might not know it in any systemic way because they only track things in terms of how much power that they confer. And so they've got a very vast array of how power functions. They only see a map of power, essentially. And they just want, essentially, a Führer to come and order the world and to maintain something that would allow them to function in it, or something like that. I've often, I'm sure other people, that Hitler's mother was, or female figure that raised him, or something like that, was probably borderline. And he probably, I think, developed his ideological sort of inclination as a sort of, as an interpretation of what would have stabilized his mother to some degree. I think that thematically sort of led him into developing the Nazi philosophy and such. So it's almost like a psychic technology. It's a psychological technology. That's sort of what fascism. It's interesting. I mean, there are intellectual similarities to Leninism to a large degree, especially in that kind of internal convolution that Leninism has between the it's this weird thing that it's not a real revolution, it's a holding action, and then it professes within itself to be a perpetual revolution. So it's like they're perpetrating state capitalism, but they label it to themselves communism. Because it's like, you have, so it's got this sort of internal double speak.
um, and the kind of belief that it requires within itself in order to patch over these sorts of anyway, I'm not going to get into this to sort of lay out those ducks in a row nicely, but anyway, there are parallels to be drawn. I mean, fascism, it's more obvious in fascism, because fascism, although there's a false consciousness in Leninism, in fascism, it's an emotional, cultural thing. In Leninism, it's an intellectual culture. It's like purely rationalized. It's probably closer to narcissism. But those things don't translate that well. I mean, if you saw Leninism as narcissism, then essentially somehow everyone is the same, you know. Like in the same way that Stalin had to applaud his own speeches. So his role, everyone's role didn't belong to them. It all belonged to everyone equally, intellectually. Anyway, that's probably too much of a tangent. But the borderline fascism stuff is more prescient, especially with the kind of SJW identity politics stuff that's happening. That's directly sort of borderline manifestation of a borderline ideology. And the imposition of these histrionic things and the things that the histrionic matrix requires, these different identity things. People have to have their identity essentially projected onto them. It's like the mark of the beast, essentially, to order this. Okay, that gets back into some archetypal language that's biblical and stuff, but anyway, let me not confuse things too much.